the Germans to attack. The third thing that is against him is that the Royal Dublin Scouting Party, a couple of days before the attack, advised that in this part of the line, the German trenches were exceptionally deep. They estimated them to be at least 60 foot deep. So therefore, a strong possibility that the 4-day bombardment was going to have little impact. And because of that, Hunter Weston, actually his corps lost the brunt of the losses, 14,500 men under his command, out of the 19,000 that were killed. He was something called a thruster. Now, a thruster, we'll come onto this a little bit later. Thrusters were generals who believed that if an objective was worth having, then there was no amount of men that couldn't be lost to take that objective. The amount of men to take an objective, it didn't matter if the objective was worth having. These were the thrusters. Now, this is a Lieutenant Colonel Crozier who he actually was very scathing. He is one of the high command, Lieutenant Colonel, very scathing about his comrades in high command. He was I know this guy was a Northern Irishman from Belfast. He was probably the perfect epitome of a soldier. He was the perfect specimen of a soldier, absolutely devoid of human emotion. He actually ordered his nephew to be executed, his only nephew, and carried it out. His nephew got executed. His crime was that he fell asleep while on duty in the trench. And he's written several books. One of them is The Men I Killed. And in that particular book, probably the greatest euphemism I have ever come across in the English language, where he says basically, there are times when local leaders can alter the situation with a display of firmness. Now, a display of firmness would be where if he came across a captain or a platoon commander who was not being sufficiently aggressive, he would draw his gun and shoot him dead on the spot. And he did that on several occasions. That was a display of firmness that could generate different behaviour. Having said that, he absolutely led by example. And the most successful unit on the 1st of July was the 36th Ulster Division, the Royal Irish Rifles Regiment primarily from East Belfast. I generalise, but in the main, they were from East Belfast. Crozier actually ignored army orders. Army orders were people of his level stayed in the trench, thrown back into the dugout, and let the men go over the top on their own. He actually did two things. One, he went over the top with them. And number two, he actually went 2 minutes early. So the order was don't leave until 7:30. He left at 7:28. And that 2 minutes gave him a chance to get across, or further across the 375 yards or whatever it was, to engage with the enemy. And he completely led bare the silliness of having commanders telling field commanders from 20 miles behind the line, telling field commanders how an attack should be conducted and what should happen during the course of a battle. He was particularly scathing about his high command. He thought Rawlinson, who led the Fourth Army, he said Rawlinson is a circus clown. He thought Robertson might make a good troop sergeant major, but that's about the height of it. And he said that Haig and French would have been shot by our own side if the infantry could have ever got their hands on them. And then if we go further down the army and look at this, is a young man, Corporal Willie Robbins, South African. He was one of two brothers. Sorry? Is she okay? Willie Robbins is one of two South African brothers. 21 years old, incredibly insightful. I read some of the things that he wrote, and he said, this war will never end by fighting. Britain has got to find the men who can equal Hindenburg. Any man can do what Haig is doing right now with the amount of men and material at his disposal. British High Command badly wants reorganising. They're nothing but a lot of mugs with titles, money and whiskey, but no brains. These runners sit 20 miles behind the lines and sip their whiskey, take all their credits and their gongs and their CBs. There's also part of his diary remains where he has the sad task of writing home to his parents to let them know that his younger brother, Percy, has been killed. And he gathered up Percy's meagre belongings, and you can imagine the heartbreak when he found that his watch had been stolen. So his watch had gone. He wrote to his parents, apologising he couldn't find the watch. But he then said, "But don't worry, his most precious possession was his little Bible." And this was an example of the Bible. It was a Standard Army issue. But in doing that, he was trying to desperately ease the pain on their parents of the loss of their 19-year-old son. Sadly, Willie Robbins was killed about 6 months later himself, so they lost both sons. It's interesting when I think I can say this without fear of contradiction. The psychology of the High Command was very much one that actually embraced losses. Casualties measured success. So the more casualties you had, the better you were doing your job, the more successful you were, because your strategy is attrition. Willie Robbins described it as winning by 1 wicket. Again, a very insightful analogy from a very young man. In September 1917, Rawlinson, who led the Fourth Army, wrote in his diary how pleased Linford was that his division had lost 11,000 men in the previous 2 months. And he's pleased because casualties measure success. And one of the things I couldn't understand when I was reading, why weren't there more mutinies? Why would these unfortunate men like Andy Symington just take all this stuff and not rise up? And the truth is, there were about 50 mutinies during the course of the war. One that I did come across was Lieutenant Colonel Sir Arthur Loveband. And as I say, mutinies were covered up very quickly, but this guy was commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. He was killed in May 1915 at the Second Battle of Ypres. On the 24th of May, they had 17 officers and 650 other ranks. 1 day later, the 25th of May, they had 2 officers and 190 other ranks. Earlier that month, they'd already lost 1,500 men out of that battalion. Now, a battalion is, in general terms, roughly, is about 1,000 men. So we'd already lost a battalion and a half, and then had all these other losses to go on top of it as well. And the truth was, when he was killed on the 25th of May, he was actually in the bottom of the trench with a blackthorn stick, beating men to go out on counterattack. And one of his artillerymen had enough, drew a gun and shot him dead. And in doing so, rid the world of a scoundrel. Now the cover-up is quite amazing. This is a cover-up in the war diary. It says, and they're talking specifically about the incident, there was no surrender, no retirement, and no quarter given or accepted. Loveband was killed by a bullet through the lip as he looked over the parapet to see how his men were getting on. Complete lie. Then if we go to the Kildare Observer, a very fine newspaper, I'm sure, June the 5th, 1915, this is their coverage of it. Seldom has the announcement of death since the present terrible campaign first brought grief and mourning to an Irish family been received with more general or genuine expressions of regret than that of Colonel Loveband, who fell valiantly in the midst of the regiment to which he was so endeared in Flanders last week. No more popular officer, we venture to say, has ever led the gallant Dublins in the course of their long and brilliant record in the annals of British warfare, and no more popular commanding officer has ever been in charge of the depot at Naas. This would have made Rupert Murdoch blush. Murdoch would probably not have, he wouldn't have gone that far. But that was the lengths that they went to try and cover things up. Now, Private Andy Symington, I said, was very lucky on the first day of the Somme. The folks were very lucky in the first day of the Somme because they didn't have to go over the top. Unfortunately, on the 12th of October 1916, that was the day when their luck ran out. It was a disaster day for the folks. And reading the battalion diary, the first thing that struck me was a note that says 9:30 p.m. orders came through to go over the top the next day. Now, 9:30 p.m. is very, very late in the day to issue an order to go over the top the next day. 9:30 p.m. is after you've had a good dinner, maybe a nice bottle of claret and a couple of whiskies, and fancy a crack at the Boche. And I suspect that was what was behind it. It then goes on to say that I don't know if you can read that or not, but considerable work in removing the wounded from previous fighting was completed by 4:30 a.m. These men had already been fighting for a week, and there they are cleaning up the detritus from previous battles to 4:30 a.m. and then going over the top at 2:30 p.m. the next day. The battle at Le Transloy had been raging for 12 days at this stage. Now, what actually happened was what the regimental diary says, such was their enthusiasm to engage, the men caught up with a creeping barrage, which inflicted losses. Such was their enthusiasm to engage, they caught up with a creeping barrage. Now, what that actually really means is that these clowns could not, because it was such a rushed and bodged operation, they could not properly coordinate the artillery and the infantry. And the way it usually worked was the artillery would lay down what they called a creeping barrage. So they would bomb everything here, and then raise their sights 100 yards further, they'd bomb everything, another 100 yards, and the infantry was supposed to come in behind them. But they didn't coordinate it properly. And the result was that most of the damages were actually caused by these men being killed by their own shells. It was a disastrous day for the folks. 385 men killed in less than an hour. The battalion strength on the October the 6th. I want you to please pay particular attention to this slide because I'm going to come back to this later. On October the 6th, they had 24 officers and 825 other ranks. On October the 13th, i.e. the day after this attack, they were down to 5 officers and only 209 other ranks. A company, which was Andy Sanden's company, had no officers left and 39 other ranks. Now that should be, a company should be around about 200 to 250 men. Yeah, there's 39 of them left and no officers. Somehow or other, Andy Symington was one of the 39. I don't know how he got through it, but he was still on his feet on the 13th of October. We'll come back to that slide later. Right, let's lighten it up a little bit. It's a heavy subject, but has anybody heard of the Wipers Times? Yeah, a good few hands go up, good. Wipers Times was a newspaper founded by a very enterprising British captain. At Ypres he found a printing press, pretty bad shape but not ruined, in a dilapidated building. He cleaned it up and started producing a paper. And I think they produced something like 24 editions of this newspaper over the course of a couple of years, produced by men in the trench, for men in the trench. And I think the word that I would use is irreverent. It was a very irreverent look at life. This is one of the adverts. Are you a victim to optimism? You don't know? Well, then ask yourself the following questions. Do you suffer from cheerfulness? Do you wake up in the morning and think all's going well with the Allies? Do you consider our leaders are competent enough to conduct this war through to a successful conclusion? And so on and so forth. If you answer yes to any of these questions, then you are in the clutches of that dread disease, optimism. But don't worry, we can cure you. 2 days spent at our establishment will effectively eradicate all traces of it from your system. Their establishment obviously was a frontline trench. Some of the finest words in the English language came from the trenches. I'm going to produce a couple of examples now, but time for a quiz. Who's up for a quiz? Okay, you're sitting comfortably? It's a picture quiz, one question. Fabulous prizes for the winner. The winner is the first person to shout out the answer. Fingers and buttons are ready. Who is that? Who said Siegfried Sassoon? That's the man back there, Chris. Keep your hand up, sir. Siegfried Sassoon is exactly right. That's who it is. Siegfried Sassoon, further back. Yeah. Make it a chance to win another one before we're over, but no. Siegfried Sassoon was that breed of poet who dealt in realism. He was not in the dulce et decorum est and how sweet and fitting it is to get blown to bits. He actually called it how it was. And one of my favourite poems from is Attack, where he actually describes what it's like to go over the top. At dawn the ridge emerges massed and dun in the wild purple of the glowering sun, smouldering through spouts of drifting smoke that shroud the menacing, scarred slope, and one by one tanks creep and topple forward to the wire. The barrage roars and lifts. Then, clumsily bowed, with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear, men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces masked with fear. What an amazing picture that paints. I'll just read it again. Lines of grey, muttering faces masked with fear. They leave their trenches going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists, and hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. Oh, Jesus, make it stop. And that was really one of the best examples I come across of what it was like in verse to go over the top. Siegfried Sassoon was nicknamed Mad Jack. He was suicidally brave. He won the Military Cross for carrying one of his colleagues through no man's land back to his own side. He actually was a story where he single-handedly chased 50 Germans from a trench, and by the time his men had caught up with them, they found him sitting in the bottom of the trench reading a book of poetry, as you would. He was very critical of the war effort and thought that the war was being spun out so that certain interests could make profit back at home, ignorant of the uncaring of the losses and deprivations that are being experienced at the front. Like Robert Graves, his friend, and like my grandfather, he suffered from shell shock and was treated at Craiglockhart near Edinburgh. Now, a different piece of poetry, and this is, has anybody heard of A.P. Herbert? Sir Alan Patrick Herbert? Yeah, there's a few, yeah, good, a few nods. Alan Patrick Herbert had a start first in jurisprudence from New College, Oxford. Now, jurisprudence is the philosophy of law. This was a man, it was an intellect which can only be described as formidable. And Major General Sir Cameron Shute, KCB, CMG, was the general in charge of the naval division of which A.P. Herbert was a member. Shute was a thruster. He was like Aylmer Hunter Weston. There's no objective that if we can take it, it doesn't matter how many men. Yeah. He was in charge of the naval division in 1916, universally hated by his the men that served under him. But he came up one day and he decided he was going to add a bit of value to the efforts in the front line, and he conducted a latrine inspection. And I don't know whether it was this being a naval division, their ablutionary practices, if I can put it like that, were maybe a little bit more flexible than other army. But the place was in a pretty dreadful condition, and a ghastly situation. So he called all his officers in and gave them an absolute dressing down, and really give him a serious telling off. Then he decided he'd added enough benefit for the day. Off he went back to his chateau for a bit of lunch. He hadn't got back home when A.P. Herbert got his pencil out and started scribbling. Now, Churchill had described A.P. Herbert as the wittiest man that he ever met in his life. He subsequently wrote many, many books and was a writer for Punch. Anyway, he penned this verse to the people with more delicate sensibilities. I will apologise now. Maybe you want to put your fingers in your ears for the next 30 seconds. I'm only reading it. So, the general inspecting the trenches exclaimed with a horrified shout, "I refuse to command a division which leaves its excreta about." But nobody took any notice. No one was prepared to refute that the presence of shit was congenial compared to the presence of shoot. And certain responsible critics made haste to reply to his words, observing that his staff advisers consisted entirely of turds. For shit may be shot at all corners, and paper supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if someone shot that shit shoot. A.P. Herbert. So, I'm going to pick out, we're getting pretty well on now. What are we going to tell you? Not too bad. But 5 to 10 minutes to go if you'll persevere with me. Pick out some of the characters. Anybody heard of Woodbine Willie? Excellent. He was an Anglican priest. We'll talk a little bit of him, a bit about Mary Barber and Geoffrey Keogh Watson. So Woodbine Willie, Geoffrey Sturrett Kennedy, actually was an Irishman. He's educated at Trinity College, Dublin. He gave away 850,000 woodbines, they estimated, during the course of the war. He would literally crawl around no man's land, giving cigarettes, which were a form of succour to the wounded and the dying, to try and help them. He wrote a poem called Carry On. It's in the book. His citation, he won the Military Cross for bravery. His citation was in the London Gazette. For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, he showed the greatest courage and disregard for his own safety in attending to the wounded under heavy fire. He searched the shell holes for our own and enemy wounded, assisting them to the dressing station. And his cheerfulness and endurance had a splendid effect upon all ranks in the front line trenches, which he constantly visited. After the war, he became a pacifist. He was appalled at post-war social inequality, how these men who'd given everything on the front came back to conditions which were actually worse than the ones they left. He was vicar at St Edmund's the Martyr. I don't know if you ever get to Bank Station and you come out at Lombard Street, turn to your right, it's that church, it's right in front of you. And because that's in Westminster, he should have been afforded a Westminster burial when he died. Unfortunately, the Dean of Westminster at the time saw him as too radical, saw him as a bit of a lefty, even though he'd never joined a political party, and he denied him the right to have that funeral. Hopefully, in doing that, he secured his own place in hell. Now, Mary Barber, here was, talk a little bit men, there were also some outstanding women in the First World War as well. Mary Barber was a Glaswegian. But again, in coming to this in my naivety, World War I, I thought as a country, we're united, we're all in it together. Oh no, not a chance. And in Glasgow was a good example. The men went to fight at the front, and then the factories were put over to helping the war effort, put over to creation of munitions, etc. To get people to work in the factories, they had to get people to come in from outside. People came in from outside to work in the factory, and that put pressure on rents. So in 1915, the landlords in Glasgow proposed a 25% rent increase to these mostly women whose husbands were at the front, giving of their blood, giving of their lives. Mary Barber had a look at it and she thought, no, I'm not going to do that. So she said, you want 25% more? I'm going to make you an offer. We'll give you nothing. We're on strike. And she masterminded the Glasgow rent strikes from her scullery. very successfully. Some very dubious tactics, I have to say. If, for example, a bailiff or a landlord or a rent collector was seen in one of the tenements, as soon as he came in, the first person who saw him would get a saucepan and beat it, make noise, and then everybody else would come out and do the same, a whole clamour, and then they would pelt this poor unfortunate with anything that came to hand. A £2 bag of flour was a particular favourite. And there are even stories of where these guys would be grabbed, manhandled, had their trousers removed, and then ejected back onto the street for that walk of shame back to their boss, covered in flour, no trousers. Did you get the rent? Sorry, boss, I didn't get the rent. She actually led a march of 25,000 people to a magistrate's court in Glasgow, where some people were being charged with non-payment of rent. And Lloyd, her influence started to move to other industrial centres like Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle. And Lloyd George stepped in smartly and introduced the Rent and Market Restrictions Act, which forbade any increase in rent until the end of the war. After the war, Mary she was the first female magistrate in Glasgow, 1928, and she also organised the first family planning clinic in Glasgow. A redoubtable woman, somebody whose spirit made a difference. Now, Geoffrey Keogh Watson was probably the epitome of the dashing boy's own hero. He was a subaltern, which is basically a lieutenant. The very good book by, maybe you see it there, by John Lewis Stemple, who he estimated that during the course of the war, subalterns, the average life expectancy was 6 weeks. Now, these were young men, mostly from privileged backgrounds, not always, but mostly from privileged backgrounds. They were gentlemen, as distinct from later in the war when a lot of these guys were killed. They had temporary gentlemen. These were men from other ranks who were promoted to become lieutenants, subalterns. He studied fine art in Brighton. He was from a military family. His father was actually born in Athlone. After the war, he spoke 8 African languages, including Hausa of Nigeria. He won the OBE after the war for services to African industry in Britain. And he also won the Military Cross during 1918. Now, we're getting close to the denouement, so please bear with me. He joined the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers on the 25th of October, 1916. He was wounded on December the 14th, 1916. Got back into the war, won the Military Cross in 1918. Then in June 1918, he moved into the nascent Royal Flying Corps. And 2 days from the end of the war, so on November the 9th, he actually was involved in an incident with some hussars. His plane got destroyed, and his pilot, that's what the planes look like, it was an RE-8 for the aviators amongst us. It's a 2-seater. The pilot sat in the front here, the machine gunner or the observer sat in the back. They saw some hussars, as I said. The pilot went down to engage. Geoffrey would have been using his machine gun. They then bolt the plane to turn round, sweep round, or re-engage. And in doing that, the plane caught a tree, crashed, burst into flames. Young Leckenby, the pilot, was killed instantly. He's buried at Escanafla. Geoffrey owed his life to a local family, the Deporters, who dragged him from the burning wreckage. And they dragged him from the burning wreckage. He had a fractured skull, broken ribs, broken leg, 3rd-degree burns. And eventually he spent 18 months in hospital to recover from that. And that was, as I said, 2 days before the end of the war, November the 9th. Now, let me take you back to that disaster day from